Thank you for joining us today for a training on the new Legal Expense Fund. I'm Leah Stromberg, Associate Counsel in the Ethics, Law, and Policy Branch at the U.S. Office of Government Ethics, or OGE. I'm excited to be here with you today to share some information about the Legal Expense Fund regulation, which was recently established by OGE and can be found in a new subpart to the Standards of Ethical Conduct for Employees of the Executive Branch at 5 CFR 2635 Subpart J. This training is one in a series of trainings that OGE will be conducting about the new Legal Expense Fund. Today is focused on how to administer LEFs, with a focus on the LEF quarterly reports, which are filed on the OGE Form 601. We will look at these reports both from the employee beneficiary's perspective, what to file, how to file, when to file, and the agency ethics official's perspective, how to review these reports and what you are looking for. Next slide, please. First, let's do a quick overview of what an LEF trust is and how you establish one. How to establish an LEF trust is covered in more detail in a separate training. Under the new Subpart J, an employee may establish an LEF for certain covered legal matters. These covered legal matters are ones that arise in connection with the employee's past or current official position, prior position on a campaign of a candidate for president or vice president, or the employee's prior position on a presidential transition team. An employee who establishes an LEF must create a trust that conforms to both the new LEF regulation and governing state law. In setting up the trust, the employee must select a trustee who will exercise exclusive control of the trust property. Then the trust documents get submitted for approval to the designated agency ethics official, or DAO, of the employee's agency. In certain limited cases involving anonymous whistleblowers and DAOs, such employees will submit their trust documents to OGE for approval. If the trust and the trustee satisfy the requirements of the regulation, the LEF trust must be approved. At this point, the trust may begin to accept contributions for those covered legal matters. Following approval of the LEF trust, the DAO must transmit the trust documents to OGE. OGE also conducts second-level review for certain employees. Once the LEF is established, employee beneficiaries must file quarterly reports. Those quarterly reports are the subject of today's training. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the filing requirements, let's consider the policy reasons behind why OGE created this quarterly filing requirement. OGE believes that the required quarterly reporting is necessary for transparency, so members of the public can have insight into who has established an LEF and how the money is flowing in and out of the LEF. This need for transparency is balanced against the employee's privacy interests, such as maintaining attorney-client privilege and donors' privacy interests. It is also balanced against the harm that an undue burden might discourage federal employees from establishing LEF trusts. Additionally, the quarterly reports help ethics officials advise employees on managing their recusal obligations, both those recusals as required by Subpart J and also any recusals that might be required under 5 CFR 2635-502, the impartiality regulation. Next slide, please. So, who should file these quarterly reports? An employee beneficiary is required to file quarterly reports until the trust is terminated or an employment termination report is filed. The reporting requirement applies even if the employee has no contributions or expenses to report. The trustee or a representative of the employee beneficiary may file the report on the employee's behalf, but the employee is required to sign it. Anonymous whistleblowers may choose to file reports anonymously through the trustee or other representative. One important thing to keep in mind: this training is focused on the LEF quarterly reporting requirements. However, if an employee beneficiary is also a confidential financial disclosure filer, a 450 filer, or a public financial disclosure filer, a 278 filer, then the employee beneficiary will need to report these donations on the gifts section of their financial disclosure reports if a donation or a series of donations from a single donor meet the gifts threshold, which is currently set at more than $480 aggregate from one source. Next slide, please. So let's just spend a moment on that financial disclosure requirement. For reportable donations to a filer's LEF, the filer may provide hyperlinks to their LEF quarterly reports, which will be made available on the OGE website instead of reporting each source whose donations aggregate to more than $480. OGE 278 filers report these gifts in Part 9, and OGE 450 filers would report these gifts in Part 5. Note that anonymous whistleblowers who have an LEF are not required to report donations to their LEF on their 450 forms. However, anonymous whistleblowers are required to report donations to their LEF on their 278 reports. Next slide, please. Okay, back to the LEF quarterly reporting requirement. Where do these reports get filed? Well, most employees will file these quarterly reports with the DAO at the agency where the employee beneficiary is employed. In instances where an employee beneficiary is a DAO, the DAO will file with OGE. Anonymous whistleblowers will also file with OGE and can do so either through their trustee or other representative. OGE will not receive reports containing classified material. If needed, an OGE employee with a security clearance will review any classified documents in a secure agency space, consistent with OGE's current practice for other ethics documents containing classified materials. Next slide, please. When to file. The OGE Form 601 must be completed on a quarterly basis until the trust is terminated or until an employment termination report is filed. Quarterly reports must cover the reporting periods seen on this slide and must comply with these due dates. If the scheduled due date falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, the report will instead be due the next business day. For each quarterly report, a single extension of 30 calendar days may be granted by the employee beneficiary's DAO for good cause upon written request by the employee beneficiary or their trustee. For those filing with OGE, OGE also has the authority to grant a 30-day extension for good cause. Next slide, please. So now that we have established some of the basics, let's turn to page 1 of the new LEF quarterly report, the OGE Form 601. The first boxes of the form require the employee to complete the quarter and the year. Up at the top are also 3 fields about trust termination, asking the filer to indicate whether this is a trust termination report, an employment termination report, or if the trust will continue after employment termination. Terminating a trust will be discussed in greater detail in the next OGE training. The next several boxes ask for the employee beneficiary's information and certification, as well as the certification of the agency ethics official, an additional reviewer, such as a supervisor or an intermediate reviewer in the ethics office, and the certification of OGE if required. Next slide, please. So as a threshold matter, contributions to the LEF should have already been screened to ensure they are from permissible donors in accordance with the new 2635-1006B. We will discuss this standard later in the presentation. For now, let's just talk about the mechanics of completing Part 1 for contributions of $250 or more. As you can see here, the contribution section requires you to complete the donor's name, city and state of the primary address of the donor. If the donor is an individual, provide the name of the donor's employer, provide the date or dates of the contributions, and provide the total amount of contributions from the donor that have not previously been reported. If you do not have anything to report, you can write none. In the contribution section, employee beneficiaries should report contributions of $250 or more made during the reporting period. You also must report contributions from a single donor of $250 or more in a single calendar year on the report filed on January 30th of the following year, unless they have been disclosed on a prior quarterly report. To illustrate, here's one example which appears on the form itself. If donor A gives you $125 in the first quarter and $150 in the second quarter, you are not required to disclose the contribution on the reports due on April 30th or July 30th, but you must disclose donor A's total $275 in contributions on your report due on January 30th. Next slide, please. Part 2 is the distribution section. Again, as a threshold matter, funds may only be used in accordance with the new 2635-1006D, which we will discuss in greater detail shortly. As you can see here, you want to report the payee name, the date or dates of distributions, the total amount of distributions to the payee that have not previously been reported, and a brief description of the reason for payment. For example, legal services or trustee fees. Report any distribution of $250 or more made during the reporting period. You also must report distributions made to a single source of $250 or more in a single calendar year on the report filed on January 30th of the following year, unless they have been disclosed on a prior quarterly report. If you do not have anything to report, you can simply write none. Here's one example which also appears on the form. If you pay ABC Law Firm $200 in the third quarter and $5,000 in the fourth quarter, you must disclose the total $5,200 distribution to ABC Law Firm on your report due on January 30th. Next slide, please. This slide shows samples that were taken from page 17 of the Employee LEF Guide, which can be found on the OGE website. On the contribution sample, I want to draw your attention to line 3, which is an example of how to report multiple donations from a single donor. On the distribution sample, notice how the purpose listed here is web design, legal services, or trustee fees. These descriptions are not very detailed, in part to avoid disclosing any information that could be privileged under the attorney-client privilege. OGE advises that the report purpose be nonspecific, similar to the examples on this slide. Once the report has been completed, the employee beneficiary should file it with their DAO. For DAOs and anonymous whistleblowers who will be submitting the form to OGE for review, please send it to lef@oge.gov. Next slide, please. Up to this point, we have discussed how an employee or a trustee completes the Form 601. The remainder of the training will be focused on how ethics officials review the reports and manage the program. The Ethics Office should know which trusts will be filing quarterly reports because the DAO would have approved the establishment of the LEF trust. As a best practice, the Ethics Office should keep track of what reports they are expecting to receive. If a report is not received on time, the ethics official should be prepared to advise the trust that they are required to cease accepting contributions and making payments until the report is received. We will discuss noncompliance in greater detail later on in the presentation. Upon receiving a quarterly report, the DAO is required to review the report within 30 calendar days of filing. DAOs are required to review the report to make sure it has been completed, to confirm that the LEF has only accepted contributions from permissible donors, to confirm that the LEF is in compliance with contribution limits, and to make sure that LEF funds are being used for purposes permitted by the regulations. Next slide, please. For purposes of the LEF, a permissible donor is defined in 5 CFR 2635-1006B. As noted on this slide, the following are not permissible donors to an LEF. I won't go through each one listed here, but I do want to highlight that donations are not prohibited from individuals seeking action from the agency on something that affects a large and diverse group of people, such as a tax return or applying for a passport. However, the employee beneficiary could not participate in the particular matter where the donor is an identifiable party, such as the donor's tax audit. The Employee LEF Guide has some really helpful information to help you figure out who is and who is not a permissible donor. Next slide, please. Additionally, a permissible donor is a national committee of a political party or, for former members of a campaign of a candidate for president or vice president, the campaign, provided that the donation is not otherwise prohibited and the entity is not substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the employee beneficiary's official duties. What that means is for former members of a campaign of a candidate for president or vice president, if a party or a campaign is affected by your work, then it may not donate to your LEF. This does not mean that the party or campaign has positions on the issues that are the focus of your agency, but rather that your work affects campaigns and parties. For example, an employee who reviews campaign filings for the FEC likely would not be able to accept donations from a campaign or political parties. A permissible donor is also an organization established as a 501c3 nonprofit for more than 2 years and is not substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of an employee beneficiary's official duties. Remember, no other entity, including for-profit businesses, are permitted to donate. Next slide, please. Turning to permissible purposes, LEF payments must be used only for certain purposes described in the regulation and listed here on this slide. Permissible purposes are an employee beneficiary's expenses related to those legal proceedings arising in connection with the employee's past or current official position, the employee's prior position on a campaign of a candidate for president or vice president, or the employee's prior position on a presidential transition team. Permissible purposes are also expenses incurred in soliciting or administering the fund, and expenses for the discharge of federal, state, and local tax liabilities that are incurred as a result of the creation, operation, or administration of the fund. The regulation provides us with this example. An employee beneficiary's attorney determines that it is necessary to employ an expert witness related to a legal proceeding arising in connection with the employee beneficiary's official position. Funds may be distributed from the legal expense fund to pay fees and expenses for the expert witness. Some examples of purposes that would not be permissible include anything that does not arise in connection with your official position, such as a personal family matter. Next slide, please. During your review of the report, if you identify that the legal expense fund has received an impermissible contribution, the contribution must be returned to the donor as soon as practicable, but no later than the next reporting due date. If the donation cannot be returned due to the donor's death or the trustee's inability to locate the donor, the contribution must be donated to certain nonprofit organizations described in the regulation. Additionally, if a quarterly report is filed after the due date, the employee forfeits the ability to accept contributions or make distributions through the trust until the report is filed. In the case of significant noncompliance, OGE has the authority to determine that the employee beneficiary may not accept contributions and make distributions through the trust or may require the termination of the trust. Next slide, please. Once the DAO has completed their review, all quarterly reports must be forwarded to OGE within 7 calendar days. In addition, OGE will also serve as the primary reviewer of all quarterly reports for anonymous whistleblowers and DAOs, meaning the agency DAOs should not review these reports and they should come straight to OGE. OGE will also conduct a secondary review of certain reports to include employees of the White House and Vice President and reports of those employees whose 278s go through OGE for review. As the second level reviewer, OGE will review the report to determine whether it conforms to the requirements in the regulations. If OGE identifies any defects, OGE will bring them to the attention of the reviewing agency, and the employee beneficiary will have 30 calendar days to take corrective action. Next slide, please. All quarterly reports, not just those reviewed by OGE, will be made available by OGE to the public on its website within 30 calendar days of receipt. The reports will be sortable by employee beneficiary's name, agency, and position, as well as the type of document and document date. Any reports that are made available will not include information that would identify individuals whose names or identities are otherwise protected from public disclosure by law. Reports filed by anonymous whistleblowers also will not be made available to the public. Next slide, please. This concludes our presentation on the LEF quarterly report, the OGE Form 601. However, we have lots of additional resources available to you on our website, oge.gov, under the Resources for Employees and Resources for Ethics Officials, both of which have specific LEF pages. I also want to point out that we will have this training video and all LEF training videos available on the LEF web pages. Thank you again for your time, and please reach out to your agency ethics official or OGE desk officer with any questions.